disclaimer, so I am a microeconomist. This is a macro topic. That means I'm wrong about small things. That's a joke.
I'll get to be wrong about the big things.
Yeah. And I want to offer some praise for this book. Usually you read books like this and it really pissed me off because people develop a few buzzwords and there's obvious kind of payoff to developing some buzzword that is just really means the sunk cost fallacy or something like that. And it's just empty, so all form, no content. But I love this book. It's written with real humility, and so there's a lot of uncertainty surrounding how crypto and cryptocurrencies are gonna and blockchain is gonna evolve. It's obviously a tremendously potentially valuable technology, and I think it's gonna change a lot of what we do. Possibly put all the bankers out there out of business, and which is moving people to higher valued uses is always a good thing. And but this book is written with a lot of humility, and I really enjoyed learned a lot about it. And anyway, thank you. And so I'll turn it to Shaun to let him introduce himself.
Sure. No, thank you. I'll say I was most nervous tonight coming and knowing that Luke had read the book. and again, Luke himself has written a book, so he knows how difficult it is to make difficult, complex subject matter enjoyable, understandable, and help everybody kind of move along. So that was high praise, and I appreciate you taking time out to do this tonight.
Oh, I'm thrilled to be here. I was skeptical about the book, but once I read it, it has tons of fun topics. You'll learn about the fake currency of the Yap people, where it's fascinating. Anyway, let me just start out with a few softball kind of general topics. So, Shaun, tell us what called you to write on the topic and a few key takeaways that our readers can get from the book.
So I've been an investment advisor for the past 2 decades, and really my career is divided into 2 parts. The first half I really focused on behavioral economics. Why do we make the decisions we make with money? And the second half was all about financial history. And any financial historian is going to study crises, above all. And one of the things that was a byproduct of all of that work was that I was able to come up with predictive models and tools that have helped me manage and predict financial crises. So it's a big help before the COVID crash and another big help before the interest rate spike this January. And so I was putting all of that information, trying to kind of make it palatable and easy for somebody that's new to the space. And while I was doing that, I was also witnessing this Bitcoin cryptocurrency rise, and it just, to me, it made perfect sense as to why this was occurring. And what I wanted to do was kind of share people, that story. And so this book is kind of that long arc of the evolution of money from, the invention of money itself, which kind of seems strange to us that there was a life before money existed. And then all the iterations that it's kind of gone through, the major big fintech disruption. So, one of the obvious ones there is the rise of central banking. And in a lot of ways, Bitcoin kind of captured this movement, which was a bit of a push back against that centralization, specifically in the Fed. And so I really wanted to kind of put all of it together in one big story. Now, what's fascinating about it, and kind of my big themes from the book are, the first, I've got really kind of 3 key themes. The first is money has an outsized effect on our lives. We all know that from economic terms, but it actually has a very big effect on our psychology. So that's one thing that I kind of want everybody to be aware of. Second is this rise of Bitcoin is not a fringe group who's just now coming out of the woodwork and kind of having this conversation about what is money and who should control it. We actually have a very long history as the users of money being very involved in this conversation. And so that's one of the themes that I really wanted to bring out to people is this is actually part of our responsibility, is having these very difficult conversations. And then the third, and I would say probably the most important theme of the book, is Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies may be here to stay. They may be a passing fad, but the underlying technology of blockchain is going to change the world, and you've got to be paying attention to it.
Thank you, thank you. So why don't you flesh out the difference between blockchain and cryptocurrency?
So most people kind of came to the word cryptocurrency when they first started hearing about Bitcoin. And what Bitcoin was a proof of concept on a peer-to-peer electronic payment system. And that proof of concept not only worked, but it started to pick up a following, and in some ways, maybe, almost seems like a religion now. Cryptocurrencies are all of the follow-on things that have kind of come out of that. And unfortunately, we gave them that word currency because it kind of confuses what they really are. Blockchain is the actual technology, the underlying technology that enables these things to work. And what's really interesting about blockchain is it just follows on to the evolution of computing. And you'll remember, for those of us that were in the 90s, you'll remember you would turn on the Today Show in the morning and they would be talking about this new thing called the World Wide Web. And they were kind of talking about it in a jokey sense. And then just a few years later, you really can't function without a website. And so blockchain is kind of that similar thing. People are talking about these notions and kind of underestimating the real role that they're going to play in life. Cryptocurrency is just one application of blockchain. NFTs is a buzzword that's become very popular over the past few months. That's just another application of blockchain. But then there are all of these people that are doing really interesting work in medical health records. So I'm very familiar with a lot of real estate work using blockchain that has nothing to do with cryptocurrency. And so one of the big themes for me is trying to explain the differences between the two concepts and also maybe give people a little bit better idea about how they should be thinking about cryptocurrencies. And I was lucky enough, I was in London on a panel and the CEO of Applied Blockchain was there, and we were talking about what is the correct way to look at a cryptocurrency. And so I mentioned Bitcoin was a proof of concept. The second one that came after that was Ethereum, and that was Vitalik Buterin. He was a genius. He was very passionate about Bitcoin, but he saw applications that went above and beyond just a peer-to-peer payment system. So he envisioned smart contracts. And so he built the Ethereum network. And what they did to fund all of that technological research was he invented the thing called the ICO, the initial coin offering. So they created this token and they distributed it out into the public market for people to buy. And that's how they raised the capital to then build out this technological development platform that he was working on. That same token also became the liquidity through which applications function on the Ethereum blockchain. And now there's actually been multiple that have come out that also function on it. So one of the ways that you want to think about what a cryptocurrency is when you're thinking about these tokens, unfortunately, they're being used as speculative assets. That's not really what they are. Some of them are flat out a joke, but most of them are, it's kind of like a startup tech company. And instead of going and getting venture capital, angel funding, and then eventually doing an IPO, instead of doing all that, they do an ICO. They raise funds in a new and innovative way, and then they use those tokens as the liquidity to function whatever operation their technological development is trying to solve. And so when you kind of look at it that way, you get a little bit better frame of reference over what are these things. But more importantly, it makes it a little bit easier to kind of gauge, and do I need to be playing in that game? Do I believe in the project they're setting out to build? Do I believe in the people involved? Do they have a likelihood of pulling this off? And those are the types of ways you should be vetting these things, not I got on Twitter and they said Shiba was going to go through the roof, and so rocket ship.
I was going to ask you to take you through, just to go back to the book so people get a real sense of what the book's about, take you through the three big movements and kind of just give us an overall arc of the book, kind of using those three big categories.
So I really start with the creation of money itself. And believe it or not, that's we've got 5,000 years of written human history and much longer before that. But believe it or not, we've only had money for 2,500 years, thereabouts. So the first kind of really big innovation was we created this thing called coinage. Now, what's funny is before that, a lot of people have in their minds, we had a barter society, then we created money, and then later we created like fancy derivatives of it and complex credit transactions. And one of the things that I found really interesting researching this is we actually had complex credit long before we had money. And so a lot of people don't appreciate just how tied human history is to financial history. In fact, I think historian Niall Ferguson said it best, financial history is the backbone of all history. And one of the things that really symbolizes that to me, and a little note from the book, is that we like to think of the creation of the written word as a very, we have a romantic idea of it, right? We were becoming very sophisticated. And so we created written word to record our progress and this, that, and the other. In reality, the oldest written words that we can find are records of who owed what to whom. And so debt and economics has been with us since the very beginning. As it progressed.
Is that the Rosetta Stone?
That's the oldest cuneiform tablets that they found. And this is an off anecdote, but I did bring up in the book that there's a documentary that basically says that original, the oldest document that they found, or of tablet that they found, is actually recording a beer transaction, which I just thought was extra humorous.
You want to tell some of those colorful stories? Like, tell us the story of Lydia.
Well, so Lydia is that's the kingdom, the area where money was actually coinage was first invented, and there's a little bit of dispute over who gets credit for it, but Croesus, I think, is the correct way to say it. But as rich as Croesus, so Croesus was the king that was credited with having created money. And just like anybody else, just like how Great Britain really refined the Bank of England and brought us into the central banking paradigm, those who innovate, those big pushes forward in financial technology tend to be very, very wealthy for a period of time. And that's why we still have that phrase, as rich as Croesus. And then I'm trying to remember the story, but basically the river that they lived near had an awful lot of just natural gold and silver, precious metals that you could just find fairly easy. And I'm trying to remember the exact story, but I think that was the river where Midas, after he had the golden touch, threw all the gold, or where it all went, but it basically trickled down the river to this society, and that's why they used it for gold, for precious metal. I mean, coinage.
What about tell us a story about the Yap?
So the Isle of Yap is, and we're, so you believe me on this one, this is Milton Friedman's really who kind of really brought this into our public conscious. And he was kind of making the comparison between the Isle of Yap and central banking. And I'll kind of walk you through it. So on the Isle of Yap, this is an ancient civilization. So their token of money were large stone discs with a hole through the center, really big things. And whoever
like
had
8 feet tall.
Yeah, there's what the Natural History Museum in Washington D.C. has one. It's right there next to the restroom. You can't miss it. But these discs, basically the quality of them and the size is what denotes their value. And what's really what Milton Friedman picked up on that was very strange is you didn't have to actually have that stone in front of your house to own it. And so they had a complex system of records of who owed what to whom and whose stone disc was whose, even if it wasn't in your physical possession. And that credit system was so advanced to the point that, and by the way, these stones are quarried on a very far away distant island, and then they're shipped to this island. Well, there was a big shipment coming in for one specific family, and we had rough weather, the boat sank. But that didn't diminish the fact that that family still owned those stone discs, And just because they were on the bottom of the ocean shouldn't erase their credit. And so they still operated as if they owned them, even though no one could ever actually lay hand or see them. And what was fascinating to Friedman was basically we had, as colonialization was occurring, we had foreign entities that were there on the islands who were just completely baffled by the fact that these stone discs mattered so much to these people. And they were having a really hard time to get the people to do what they wanted to do. And so what they did is they went around and they put a big black X on all of the stone discs. And that conveyed that they now owned those discs. And they wouldn't remove that big black X unless that family went and did whatever task they needed done. And then they would go through and get rid of the black X, restore everybody's credit, and everything was fine. And Friedman equated that to the same thing as, with the Federal Reserve's holding, piles of gold bars, and each one has a different little cubby that says, this is France's, this is the United Kingdom's. And when one country transacts with another, all the Federal Reserve does is they go down and say, this isn't France's, this is now Great Britain's. The gold doesn't move, it doesn't change. We just make the equivalent of a black X on it. So it was a really fascinating story.
Okay, so that's the creation of money. The central bank, what comes next? Central banking?
Yeah, I really skipped over just banking itself, because banking itself, especially fractional reserve banking, is kind of its own special history. But in terms of really moving society forward, it was the creation of central banking. And one of the tidbits, so I mentioned earlier, the Bank of England is really the model that kind of set the stage for all the central banks that came after it. But it wasn't the first. It was actually Sweden that came up with the first central bank, and it ended in failure. And the reason it ended in failure is kind of a very prescient message for today. And it was the head of the central bank of Sweden was Johan Palmstrup. And this guy was a hero. He created this thing called the central bank, and all of a sudden the economy boomed. But at some point, he started to feel he was very tied to his community. And so he would continue to extend credit even beyond really where the reserve requirements were at the time. And so he really just kind of kept writing checks. And ultimately that led to a really big inflation boom, and then ultimately the bust. And eventually that, I'm trying to remember exactly what his fate was, but it wasn't good.
No, he was killed.
Yeah, that's putting it lightly. So, but I find that very interesting compared to today's environment. But it was really the Bank of England that introduced the model that seemed to work. And Felix Martin is a great author, and he calls that the Great Monetary Settlement. But what was really fascinating about Felix Martin's approach to this, and I found this to be very helpful in terms of understanding central banking, is the crown at the time, like many crowns, was very good at spending money, not quite as good at raising money. And so the primary method for raising money was seigniorage, which is they would call the coinage in, recoin it, or start to debase the coinage. And so what you ended up with was just kind of these big inflationary spirals. Meanwhile, the merchant class, the users of money and those who were out earning the money, had a very big problem with runaway inflation and debasement. And so, long story short, the sovereigns found that their interest payments when they needed to borrow money started going higher and higher. That was a very difficult situation. So the novel idea that was the Bank of England was essentially a monetary settlement.
Let me just interrupt here for a sec, because I know that a lot of people, this may be going a little bit too fast, but when there's inflation and you borrow money, you pay back in deflated dollars. They don't have the same value. And so that's, so the very real favoring of borrowers over the lenders. Lenders hate inflation. The borrowers love it. Oh my goodness, because they're paying back in debased currency. And that's why inflation is a problem for credit.
So the big settlement was the crown, the sovereign, would hand over the control of the money supply. to private bankers, basically. And so we created this public-private partnership. So the trade-off for the sovereign is they got lower borrowing rates because they're now, it's this very credit-worthy group who's managing the money supply, not the reckless king. And so it was this really nice kind of in-between. And basically from there, you started seeing central banks pop up all over the place. The US was actually a holdout, and the Federal Reserve's not our first central bank. We've been through several iterations, but the Fed was kind of the first holdout, and then it's now become the largest central bank and I don't necessarily just mean largest, I mean the most powerful. It is at the center of the entire global monetary system.
And the reason for that is, of course, that people trust the Federal Reserve more than they do kind of other currencies. A lot of countries have monetized their economies because they don't trust their own central banks. Hey, let's free ride off the U.S. And anyway, that's a huge benefit, having a bank like that. I want to kind of get okay. Let's just go to the third wave.
So we had the central banks that brought in this era that we're all in, and now for the first time in history, really all the societies around the planet are into this one thing, and I call it monetary society. So we're using money as the measure of everything. Well, now we get this kind of backlash against the central banks. And what's the problem with that? It's the centralized authority, all right? And especially if we feel like the centralized authority isn't doing things in our interest, they're doing them for some other group's interest. And it's this notion of control, really. That's kind of the key thing. So you get this new technology that enables peer-to-peer money transfer. And that was Bitcoin. And that became very popular amongst a group of people who were really trying to kind of push back against this central bank paradigm. But what's fascinating about it is it really is an effective technology. Now, at the time that Bitcoin was created, it was built on a proof of work standard. And that's something that's starting to change in the industry. But what that meant, in order for us to trust it, it had to be a rigorous computing driven system. And what's fascinating about just all the cryptocurrencies is it's actually, I mentioned earlier that it's the next wave of technology. What makes it the next wave is that for the first time, we're actually sharing all of the data. The data is out there and it's in the public, and anybody anywhere on the planet can see it. The way we still make it secure is we use an old tool from cryptography, which is the easiest way I can think of it is the one-time pad, one of the most proven ways to protect an encoded message. And that is, you and I will each use a one-time use pad that allows us to send an encrypted message to one another. Once we use it, we throw it away, never used again, so it's really impossible to break. So Bitcoin and all blockchain runs off of this public-private key system. So the public key is out there, everybody can see it, but only the intended recipient has the private key that'll match up. So what's happening, the big difference between blockchain and everything that's come before it is instead of centralizing all of the data in one place, this is what was cloud computing, right? Cloud computing is all the data is stored in one place, one powerful central server that is owned by one or two companies. And that's the choke point. But you, the user, can be anywhere in the world and link to that server and get the data that you need and be able to function. Well, what blockchain is doing is it's distributing that data all throughout the network. And the network is millions of computers spread all over the world. And so for the first time, the data isn't centralized in one place. And George Gilder calls this sky computing. It's that next evolution where all of the data isn't in one centralized location. Now, the problem with cryptocurrency that we've all seen is when they built them, they were great kind of in their little ecosystem. But as they've gotten much bigger, there's been a scalability issue. And so now that scalability issue is really focused in how much energy they're consuming, and that's becoming a very big deal. And so especially if ESG, that environmental social governance theme, which has dominated the investment landscape, if that is to continue on, we cannot be consuming this much energy in these cryptocurrencies if that's, in any blockchain, if we're really going to adopt it. So that's why the entire industry has been shifting from proof of work, which is that heavy computing power driven system, to a proof of stake system, much more energy efficient. But now we run back into the centralization of power issue. And so that's why I tell people my big theme here is blockchain is going to revolutionize things, but it's going to be a lot of boring things that have nothing to do with money. It's going to be a lot of business operational efficiency stuff. The money part is just kind of allowed cryptocurrencies to kind of suck the air out of the room when we really should be focusing on blockchain. And I say all of this to say it is so early in this game, and yet there's already so much money at stake because of what's happened with Bitcoin and all the other cryptocurrencies.
Can you offer us any investment advice?
So the number one question I get is, so do you like this cryptocurrency or that one? Is it Solana or is it going to be Cardano? And the thing I would tell you is if you're going to be exploring this environment with money, then you really need to be evaluating what are the projects, what are they trying to solve, who are the people involved, and you really do need to think about it as you're investing in a speculative tech startup. More importantly, and this is really, really significant, this is still the Wild West. And I think there's some really good examples of that. The Squid token that came out recently that ended up being just a flat out fraud. I mean, this is really only true gunslingers allowed kind of an environment. And the reason why I say that is you have to keep in mind, this is a totally unregulated as of yet area. And there's all these different degrees of calls for regulation. And because it's so much money at stake, that's why this is becoming a really big deal. I was fortunate enough to be at the launch of the Federal Reserve of New York's Innovation Center last week. And there's two major focuses that Jerome Powell emphasized at that launch, and that is exploring the central bank digital currency and then exploring cross-border payments. Those are the two primary goals right now, and this is a partnership between the Fed and the Bank for International Settlements. And so if we just look at China, Niall Ferguson correctly predicted that China would be the first sovereign nation to create a digital currency. And they did. And shortly after that, they outlawed all cryptocurrencies, mining, all of that. So my point there is this stuff can turn really, really fast. And so you've got to be very careful with it if you're in it just as a speculative asset.
Do you trust the Chinese government not to use the information contained in the blockchain to go after people?
Yeah, I mean, that's a tough question. And the reason why I say that is anybody that pays attention to investment markets, especially over the past week and really over the past several months, will know that China has been a series of uncertainty after uncertainty of change in regulations, the rules of the road shifting. And I can tell you this, from respect to money, rules of the road really matter. And the reason why the US is where the US is, and the reason why the dollar is what it is to the globe, is because of the rules of the road. It's primarily, we're beneficiaries of the 1944 Bretton Woods Agreement. Even though that agreement fell apart, the legacy of it is really what gives us our competitive advantage right now relative to everybody else. China desperately wants to be a major player, and you do have to understand that some of the moves that they make are not designed to set them back. In their minds, they're setting themselves up for a stronger future. And that remains to be seen how that's going to work. I mean, we were talking about it before we started tonight. Inclusive economic systems and inclusive governmental systems tend to win out over the long run. And so that's something that, at least from my perspective, is needed.
I mean, I don't really pretend to know what's going to happen, but I'm kind of thinking that China's going to be able to track. Do you trust that it's going to be anonymous? I mean, and they'll be able to track transactions and kind of, okay, here's a training set of people who are loyalists and people who are dissidents. I'm going to use machine learning to kind of distinguish between, to be able to predict who's in which set. And I'm not going to even wait. Hey, if you have a 0.8 probability of being a dissident, hey, you're gone.
Yeah, I think it's a real-time social experiment that we all get to watch. For me, the real test as it relates to blockchain is who will be the next countries to release a digital currency. I mean, we see that El Salvador is just going with Bitcoin, and that's going to be fascinating for us to watch to see how it plays out. For me, it's going to be who's going to be the next player. At what point does the Federal Reserve step in and introduce a central bank digital currency? The Bank for International Settlements has been all over trying to come up with frameworks on how to incorporate all of this. But it would not surprise me to see that once all the sovereigns have kind of figured the game out and know what they're doing, if all of a sudden we're going to get very real regulation of all of these others. And I mean, if you're in that space investing in, or worse yet, speculating, that's your number one risk, and because it can happen at any point in time.
As you say, okay, so before, I just want to cover a couple of things that obviously occur to a lot of people. What the heck with NFTs? So why don't you describe people what an NFT is and why the heck are they valuable?
So in January of this year, I was telling my wife and family about NFTs, and they all looked at me and said, that's ridiculous. So what an NFT is, it's a non-fungible token. All that means to you is it's a single digital item that you're able to truly create scarcity with. So you can create an NFT of one, or you can create a limited series of 100. But the point is, you're able to use the blockchain, which is everybody can view it, everybody can see it, to verify the records and show authenticity. So this is that one piece of art. So in the world of art, if we have the Mona Lisa or any other famous painting behind us, how do we know we're looking at the real one? Well, typically we'd have to actually turn it around, take it off of the frame, and actually look at the edges and look at the back, because that's where in the art world they keep the record, if you will. So blockchain is essentially enabling you to do that with technology. It's able to say, no, this is the actual one. What's really interesting about this, and this is where, in my mind, this is just another one of those big disruptions, is on the starving artist paradigm. If I'm an artist and I create this piece of work and I sell it, that one time, that first sale in the analog world, that was the only time I'm getting revenue. Every time it sells after that, I'm not getting a trail on that. So that's the big difference, because in blockchain with an NFT, I, as the artist, can set what I want my residual income to be. So every time it changes hands from here on out, I'm going to get that fee. So I'm really I'm financially involved with the art. I get royalties. Now, in Nashville, royalties, especially for music, this is a very big deal. And that's the Mechanical Licensing Collective is all about trying to build out, how do we make sure that these artists are getting the money they deserve for their creative work? Well, NFTs are not only allowing, you can do it for music, you can do it for limited video clips, whatever you want, Jack Dorsey's first tweet. But they're doing the same thing. They're enabling artists to get paid, and they're trying to essentially break that starving artist paradigm. And we've seen tremendous success. I mean, you see these things are clearing the markets for, millions and millions. There's even ones that are going for 60 and 80 million. There's an awful lot of craziness in that market. And I mean, to be fair, with all of this stuff, we're still in the Wild West, so there's still going to be craziness. But at the end of the day, the underlying structure is enabling us to do something we couldn't do before. And that's the value of technology.
So let me turn a little bit to bubbles, and let me ask about. I was fascinated to read the your tracking down to the first bubble that you could find was in AD 33. I think this was AD 33, and it explains kind of maybe take us through that story and kind of relate it to currency bubbles and I want you to end up with, hey, are we in a bubble right now? And a bubble, and the irony of the definition of bubble is something that economists can't explain. So the irony of an economist trying to explain a bubble, I get it. Okay, go ahead.
So the bubble you're referring to was a real estate and credit bubble that was in Rome. And basically the Senate, they got together and they decided, I think we've got some excess speculation going on. So what we're going to do, they didn't actually create new rules or new laws. What they said is we're going to enforce Julius Caesar's rules, because this was, not long after Julius Caesar, some 30 years. We're going to enforce his rules. And when they did that, they found out that everybody was overextended, including, I can't remember the exact percentage, but it was like 3/4 of the Senate were all overextended. A massive bust ensued. It was a really big issue, and they ended up having to essentially bail themselves out by saying, okay, we're going to relax the rules for a period of time. We're going to refinance it at inflated values, and we're going to work our way out of this, which they did. The point of that is to say that, bubbles and manias, everybody's familiar with the tulip mania. My personal favorite story in the world is the first stock market bubble, and that was the South Sea bubble. And at the time, Sir Isaac Newton was the head of the U.S. or the Royal Mint. So here's arguably one of the most intelligent people on the planet, in one of the most powerful financial positions at the time. And he was a participant in the South Sea bubble. And he rode those stocks up, and he was loving it. And eventually, a believer in his own laws of motion, he said, what goes up must come down. So he sold, backed out of the market. And then what happened? Kept going up till it drove him crazy. There must be some information he missed or misinterpreted. So he bought back in just in time for the bubble to collapse. He lost what was reported to be roughly $3 million today, but in 1720, that was an awful lot more money. And he never talked about it again. He took it to his grave with him. So
all my rich friends sold too early.
So my point of telling that, and every year when I come back and do the guest lecture for Dr. Parsley's class, I always end with that story. And it's because we as humans get caught up in this stuff, and all bubbles start with a grain of truth, and we just kind of take them too far. And that's the real trick about financial markets. Financial markets, we swing to the extremes. We never get it right. Just like the Fed cannot get the interest rate exactly right. They're never going to do that. They're going to go up too high and ultimately end up seizing up the economy. Then they have to lower it back down. Then they stay low too long, and then they have to come back up. It's just cycles. We kind of continue this paradigm. So the question is, are we in a bubble now? And this is a hot topic. What it's been called is the everything bubble, because what's different about this go round is that everything's inflated. It's stock prices, it's real estate, even bonds, right? Their interest rates are so low, that means their price is so high. And we've been paying a lot of attention to valuations lately just because that's a hot topic. And you look at the PE ratio on the market, you're making these evaluations, but the fixed income market, the PE on a treasury is like 70 times earnings. So it's literally everywhere. Now, how is this going to end? That ultimately depends on how the financial authorities are going to kind of try to navigate these waters. And a lot of what you're seeing in Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies is trying to find an alternate, trying to get into something else other than these traditional assets, which we fear are in a bubble. And honestly, we're going to have to see. I do not envy a central banker right now. This is going to be the most difficult dance to try to tango their way out of.
So So one of the things that seems let me just take you back to 2007. In 2007, before the real estate bubble in 2008 popped, we had about $700 billion in circulation. What that means is the Federal Reserve kind of writes a Federal Reserve note. They just write a check and they buy stuff, and they buy government debt and they put it on their balance sheet. So yeah, it's safe. And basically they're just writing checks. And if you'd ask any macroeconomist, remember they're wrong about the big things. In 2007, if you had asked them what would happen if we had increased the money supply by a factor of 10, they all would have said, hey, we'd have Venezuela-style hyperinflation. Now, we never got that. Why not?
So this is a really fascinating thing, because I'll tell you, we were managing portfolios at the time, and we all positioned for inflation because it was such a given. We just knew with that much money printing, we were going to have inflation. And if you take a bigger step back and really look at some of these longer term trends, and the Bank of England put out a working paper, I think it's working paper 945. This one is really special because what they did is they took interest rates all the way back to the Black Plague, which is 1340, somewhere thereabouts. And if you look at that, you're going to see just a line going straight down. Interest rates have been systematically declining for 8 centuries. And so, one of the things we have an issue with in our minds is we think of our recent history. We think in our lives are so small compared to like the big arc of history that we're using the information that we have, right? And so most of us just knew that interest rates were going to go back to, this 4 or 5%. And in fact, today, everybody's hoping for a normalization. And the reality is the Fed will start raising rates. I mean, they're telling us they're going to do it, but they're not going to get back to where they were before. We're kind of systematically going into a lower interest rate environment. And there's a lot of reasons for that. Part of it is we have better liquidity and transparency these days than we used to have. So we got a little bit more protection, if you will, on understanding what's going to happen. But another big effect is technology. And people don't think about it, but technology is very deflationary. And so the more that you and I can get a lot more productivity done with fewer resources and less time, that's actually a pretty deflationary force. And so as inflationary as all of that fiat money going into the system was, it didn't overpower the globalization that we had, that ability for us to just send work overseas, and that ability for us to do more with less. Another big part of especially the great financial crisis, the Fed writes checks, but they give it to the bank. Well, the money wasn't making it out of the banks at the time. And that's really where you get that money multiplier, that expansion of inflation, is when the Fed gives the money to the banks and then the banks lend it out 9 to 1. That's when it goes. And if you'll remember at the time, the banks had trouble. So they were very timid on lending that money out. So we didn't get that liquidity explosion that a lot of people expected to have happen. And one of the questions I get a lot now is, well, given where we're at now, if we thought it was going to be inflationary then, given where we're at now, isn't it going to be this is going to be 1970s all over again? And two of the things that you want to look at there is that we've had a demand spike, but we haven't had a supply shock like we had in the 70s. And then the second big component was the 70s was when, 1971 is when the Bretton Woods system ended and the dollar broke the link to gold. Now, the reason why that's important is because that was the first time in human history where all the currencies of the world were untethered to gold. So that was the end of the gold standard. So what the 1970s were a lot of was that searching for what is the value of these fiat dollars, which brings me back to Bitcoin. One of the big pushes for Bitcoin is it's a limited supply. We know exactly how many Bitcoins are going to be released in total, and we know exactly their rate of release. So that's why a lot of people are calling that the new digital gold. That's that new discipline in this world of fiat currencies. And so it's really fascinating how we've kind of come full circle, and instead of gold playing the role now, it's this new technology.
So you never asked the question, are we in a bubble? Just yes or no.
I don't know.
Okay,
I mean, and
okay.
anybody that tells you they
humility.
do
I
know
love
is
the humility.
off, because at the end of the day, that's all relative, right?
Yeah,
It's relative to whether or not it pops.
Yeah, I love the humility. Hey, I want to ask about the Cyprus, the Cyprus freezing the bank accounts. Does cryptocurrency make it easier for the governments to confiscate our wealth?
No, not now. So, one of the things that I'll get calls from people that are very concerned about fiat currency.
Why don't you explain the Cypriot story first? Yeah.
I'll get there.
Okay.
So I'll get calls from people who are concerned about fiat currency, and they're concerned about what if the government closes and locks down the banks. And ironically, I get calls from people saying, should I move my money to somewhere like Cyprus? Which is funny to me, because Cyprus actually did lock down the banks and restrict people's access to funds. And so a lot of very conservative approaches to the monetary system view Cyprus as kind of the signal for what will happen in the next big financial catastrophes. And that is that the banks will freeze assets, they'll limit us all to just a very small amount of money per day out of the ATM. And so that's another reason why you've seen large dollars flowing into crypto assets. Now, to your question, can the governments freeze cryptocurrencies? They can't necessarily freeze them, but they can certainly outlaw them overnight. And that will create all kinds of issues. And here's kind of my theme, and this is just knowing financial history and knowing crises. It's not that someone prevents you from getting your money. It's what if all of you want your money at the exact same time? What is it now worth, right? What are you actually getting? So if we're all trying to sell at the exact same time, there is no liquidity, the price goes into free fall, and it's worthless. That's the problem. And so it's not, I don't even think that authorities have to seize the assets. I think they can just make it illegal overnight. And if you don't think that's doable, just think Roosevelt made gold illegal and we couldn't hold gold for decades. And so, I mean, it can happen. And so you got to be attentive to the risks. And again, I feel like we keep kind of segueing away from the theme of pay attention to the technology. The technology is real and the technology is going to help us. Don't get so caught up in blockchain is Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies. Those are just one application of this very powerful tool.
So it's easy to predict that title insurance industry is going to disappear, right?
I'm personally working with people on that exact problem.
Really?
So we're not alone. There's a bunch of people in that space.
Yeah. Okay. So that's easy. That's easy to predict. So it's a lot harder to kind of predict the other nuances of blockchain. I mean, it just I think it's really fascinating. So let's talk about China a little bit. So they seem like they're on the verge of a credit crisis, but the centralized authorities try to control it in various ways, and it just seems like, I don't know, it just has all the you see the debt, you see the bankruptcy starting to happen, and with Evergrande. I mean, do you have any kind of perspective on what's going on with China?
So my expectation is that in a lot of other economies, this very well could topple them. And that's what everybody keeps asking, is Evergrande China's Lehman moment? And my take on that is that China has tools at their disposal that not every other country has available to them. And more importantly, I think it's exceptionally important to China for this not to be a Lehman moment, and for them to really kind of show the US that they can handle these things better. And so I wouldn't expect imminent doom there, because I think they're gonna do an awful lot of stuff to prevent that from happening. So we'll see how it goes. But I see Allie's giving us signal.
Okay. So anyway, so I'm out of questions. And so let's go to the audience and see if anybody is Allie, do you have a traveling mic? Okay, we don't.
We'll just repeat it.
Okay, we'll repeat the questions. Go ahead. Anybody have any questions?
We did that good.
You talked about ICOs, but how about EAOs? So the newer version of how projects are becoming funded. My understanding is ICOs are no longer really the funding source.
Yeah, and
So repeat the question.
oh, sorry. We mentioned ICOs as initial coin offerings, and now we're seeing transition to, was it DEOs? DAOs. Yeah, one of the things, so I think that's a good question, because one of the things that we're seeing in the industry as a whole is we've moved from beyond just the cryptocurrencies. Now we're seeing all of the other financial derivatives are coming into play, specifically with the DeFi movement. And so that's all of a sudden now we're having lending capacity, we're having the ability for you to earn interest and staking programs. And what's interesting to me is that as that kind of movement has grown up, we're actually starting to see a lot more pressure from the system on needing regulation. And so my expectation is that either the system will kind of continue to evolve and innovate, and regulatory authorities are going to kind of keep chasing the ball, or we're going to actually finally get some type of good framework. And I think that's the kind of the effort that's coming out of the Fed, and then they're working with SEC, who's working on XRP, and so we'll see how it all kind of evolves. But yeah, I mean, that's what I like about all of this is there's so much innovation from both the funding source, but also the use, that it's a fascinating place to watch. Yep.
Hey, Mike Billings, I work at the investment office at the institution. How would you compare this moment in history to the internet bubble?
So they're very similar, and what I mean by that is you've seen the exact same investor behavior that you saw in 98, 99.
So repeat the question.
Oh, sorry. How do we compare this period to the internet bubble, late 1990s? And so one of the key things, like, you know, the symbols to me are pretty much anything that was crypto was getting a bid, and that's kind of silly for there to be this new frontier, way out there fringe stuff, and yet all of them are getting a bid, even silly ones. And then what's even worse about that is that anything that has to do, any of the stocks that changed their name or put in their annual report or decided that they were going to start accepting any of the cryptocurrencies, all of a sudden they caught a bid. They started going up in value. And you know, I think it's interesting. The latest move there is Jack Dorsey changing Square to Block, because he's really wanting to focus like, we own blockchain. And so I think all of that speculative behavior is the same as it was in the 90s. What's interesting about today is we're not seeing that one crash, right? Like in the 90s, we bid up all the tech stocks, anything that was technological, you were guaranteed a massive return. And then that whole market just started to roll over and collapse. And what we're seeing in this market is very different, because what we're seeing is just these rolling corrections. And so today, I mean, the S&P ended up good. We're doing pretty good on the index level. But if you go down and look a little bit deeper, you're seeing really high multiple tech stocks that were, could have limitless valuations 3 weeks ago. Now all of a sudden they're all down. Kathy Ark's, every holding except one is down 20%. And so what you're seeing now that's very different from then is at the index level, we're staying fairly consistent, but throughout, we're just systematically going through sector after sector and just knocking them down, moving on to the next one. And then these guys slowly kind of start to build their way back up, but we're taking down other sectors. And I think that's kind of part of this everything bubble. the phrase that comes out of everything bubble is TINA, which is there is no alternative to stocks. And so we're looking around and, money only has a few places to hide. And so, short of there being another place to go, it's really hard to basically just close the book on a sector or on any, on a security. Because if you remember, coming .com bubble, you could have gone into bonds, you could have gone into cash, and you could have had a fairly predictable, reasonable rate of return without a lot of risk. And you could do that in the financial crisis. You could come out. I mean, I remember we actually had a conversation about it, and you were talking about that Vanderbilt actually was looking at the valuations in the market and then looking at what they could get in treasuries and started shifting money over to treasuries just because there was, might as well take
the risk premium disappeared in 2008. So you have to be compensated for bearing risk. Otherwise, you're not going to bear it. And so, and the compensation you got for bearing the risk of risky assets was really, really low. And so when the risk reappeared, that those differences when we started recognizing, it's like you're ignoring the risk in these very risky assets.
And so we compare those two time periods, our most recent, to today. If I bail out of stocks or crypto or whatever it is, and I go for that safety trade, I mean, I literally have zero on cash in what we are fully aware is an inflationary environment. And if I go to my safety trade, I'm still looking at negative real return. And so that's what's really different about this environment is there's nowhere really to hide. And that's why, I mean, it'll sound completely boring, but that's why diversification matters more now than in any other environment, just because any of these things can fall at any moment in time. And we've literally, that's what this year's been, is we've just been watching them just roll through the market. And thanks for coming, by the way. Thanks for connecting on LinkedIn. Yep.
Do you have a view on Tether and stablecoin and reserves? And
yeah, so
I just let me just preface that I don't know. I think it's Bloomberg. I don't know if there's anything to it in terms of part of the reserves. I think some of the market speculation has been a lot of it's CP and Evergrande or other Chinese developers.
Yeah, so I talk about this in the book.
Try to repeat the
question. Sorry.
Yeah.
View on, I'm like really bad at that.
Yeah.
Views on stable coins. And I talk about this a little bit in the book. And so what makes stable coins unique, and they're actually getting a much tighter level of scrutiny than some of the other coins, which are more project based. And that's because of this implicit guarantee that this thing is going to be pegged to the dollar, whatever you peg it to. And I'll point out the reason why that really, really matters to somebody that pays attention to financial history is anytime you have a currency peg, that is a really dangerous game to play because market forces can shift on you. And if you don't have the reserves to maintain the peg, then you go bust, and that's a real big problem. And so, one of the things I used to scan for is I would look at countries and look at their currencies and see what their peg was. And then all you have to do, I mean, that's George Soros became famous because of his pressure on the British pound. So my point is, I do worry about stable coins, and I worry about them from I know how difficult a task that is to maintain those pegs. And better believe if somebody's fallen short on their reserves, they're under so much pressure from the regulatory environment. That's like, to me, from a regulatory standpoint, that's the easy fruit. That's who you go after first.
Are the stable coins being rehypothecated? The money multiplier people are falling against them, being re-leveraged through the crypto world or financial markets generally?
Yeah, I'm not as familiar with stable coins being involved in any kind of interest bearing or borrowing against collateralization. Typically, it's actually fairly interesting that there's a unique group of tokens that you can earn interest on. There's a unique group that you can borrow against. It's not ubiquitous, or at least not on any of the platforms that I would deal with, which again, I would tell people, if you're dabbling in this space, you do need to be paying attention to what platforms you're on. If you're new to the area, just keep in mind the early years of this business, and well, not even that early, like 2015, 2016, we were seeing a wide number of exchanges. Really, the biggest exchanges in the businesses just going out of business overnight. And that seems to have kind of fallen off a little bit. But what I tell you is that's like, really, you have counterparty risk just as much as you have security risk. So it kind of it goes all the way down. You really need to be careful. But I'm just not a huge fan of stable coins because I know how challenging that is. And I know I mean, if I were a regulator, that's exactly who I would be looking at first. Yep.
So we have time for one more question. We'll take one from one of our virtual audience members. They ask, could you use blockchain technology, cryptocurrency to incentivize a social outcome like that?
So, well, let me repeat the question. This was one of the online questions, and it's, could you use blockchain or cryptocurrency to incentivize something like empathy? Was that right? And I would dare, I'm not familiar with anybody working on a project like that, but I would dare to say yes. And I'm not sure how you would do it, but I can tell you the social pressures are also affecting this industry. And we talked about it a little bit ago when I was talking about the energy consumption. So just to talk a little bit about the Bitcoin community, the Bitcoin community has been, since its creation, really resistant to change. And recently we saw the most latest upgrade. They actually upgraded to give themselves the ability to do smart contracts in the future. The whole reason Vitalik Buterin left Bitcoin and created Ethereum was because they were so resistant to that technology, which most people would agree is beneficial to the system. So I say all of that to say that going back to Bitcoin, there's pressure on Bitcoin now because of the energy consumption, so much so that there's discussion about, do we fragment it and say, these are green Bitcoins and these are not. And so this is all a really big conversation in the Bitcoin world that doesn't have anything to do with Bitcoin. It has everything to do with environmental, social, governance, kind of this moral responsibility that is really placing a heavy hand on the investment market. And most of us would agree for good. And so my thought is, if you can get that kind of an influence on Bitcoin, the notorious holdouts, and obviously the biggest success story in the space, then my expectation is you could probably use blockchain to incentivize some form of empathy. Oh, and so I guess that's it. We're out of time. Well, I certainly had fun.
Well, thank you very much for, yeah, that was great. It was great. Thank you very much.
Before we lose everybody online, I'll tell you, I write a regular market commentary on all subjects, and sometimes it's history, sometimes it's crypto, sometimes it's just interest rates. So if you're interested in that, you can email me directly, or I've got a web page in the back of the book for everybody that gets it. And so I'll just say my email real quick, just in case anybody needs it. And that's Shaun, SHAUN .rcg@icloud.com. And with that, I want to thank Owen Forward for doing this. This is a lot of fun. And especially thank Luke for coming back.
No, I'm thrilled. The book is actually a really easy read, and it's got lots of colorful stories in it that I just had no idea about, and I learned a lot. Thanks, Shaun.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, everybody.